Hello, this is Chris Kallal. I'm a territory agronomist for DeKalb Asgrow in West Central Illinois. I wanted to take a little time here and share with you some results from some crown rot trials I've done the last 3 years. First, a little bit of background to help set up why I decided to look into this, but it goes back to the fall of 2018 when we had a lot of issues with crown rot and we didn't have a lot of answers for some of the questions by customers. Crown rot is caused by a fungal pathogen, and predominantly it's Fusarium. There can be other pathogens at play, but predominantly it is Fusarium. And typically that infection happens early on in the corn plant's life cycle. And then as the growing season goes on, the visual symptomology generally starts to show up during grain fill and as we start to approach maturity. And as that crown of the plant, seen there in the lower right-hand picture, starts to deteriorate, the movement of water and nutrients from the roots into the plant becomes progressively more limited. Essentially, that crown is the base of the stalk that's just below the surface where all the crown roots come into the plant. And in severe cases, the flow of the water and nutrients can be totally shut off because that crown can actually die prematurely. And that premature death is what we refer to as ghosting of plants, and that's what you see there in the top right. It's really evident as you think about walking green corn or picking green corn and you see these random dead plants. That also then leads to opportunistic stalk rot pathogens setting in, ultimately yield loss, and standability concerns. One thing I thought I would point out is just because you don't see any ghosted plants doesn't mean you don't have the infection, right? There's a spectrum of the infection and the symptoms that it exhibits. So you could have a slight infestation or infection that has a lot of plants infected, but you may not see any visual symptomology of it. Toward the other end of the spectrum is that ghosted plant that died prematurely. So after that fall of 18, I decided to do some trial work. My original design was one susceptible hybrid with 2 different seed treatments, 2 different in-furrow fungicide applications, a V5, V6 fungicide application component, and then a VTR1 fungicide application component as well. Some other entries that I've had in my trial work were some other in-furrow products, 2 of those being from competitive companies, one of them being another Bayer product. In 2020, I incorporated a tolerant hybrid and kept with that in 2021. And then here in 21, I included a hybrid screen where I planted 2 rows of 12 different hybrids so that I could take ratings on individual hybrids at each one of these trial locations. In regards to the locations, I've targeted fields to plant these trials in that had a known history of crown rot. And a couple of these locations are actually in fields that initiated me to do the work after the fall of 18. Majority of my locations have been in corn on corn. Each of the 3 years that I've done it, I've planted 4 locations. I lost a location in both 19 and 20 due to river flooding in a river bottom field. So I have 10 locations total in the data summary, and of those 10 locations, 6 of them have a VT fungicide split. So now let's shift and take a look at some of the data. In this graph, I've got depicted here the yield and the infection ratings of each treatment, summarized across all the locations in all years. So not only did I look at yield, I also went back in just prior to harvest and took ratings on the percent infection within each treatment. And that's what's shown here in this graph. So the green bars would represent the yield of each treatment against the axis there on the left-hand column of the chart. The yellow line would indicate the infection rates of each treatment against the right side of the chart. I've put a solid black line between the susceptible and the tolerant hybrids in the data. So the susceptible hybrids, I've got 3 years of data on and 10 locations in that summary. On the more tolerant hybrid, I've got 2 years worth of data and 7 locations. As I look at the data in this graph, what really jumps out to me is the variability in both the yield and infection rates on the susceptible hybrid on the left-hand side. So you see more bounce in that data, whereas on the right-hand side, on the more tolerant hybrid, there's not as much bounce or variability from one treatment to the next. And I think that stems from the fact that when you've got a more tolerant hybrid genetically to crown rot, the genetics itself is doing the majority of the heavy lifting in warding off the crown rot. Whereas when you've got more of a susceptible hybrid, the treatments are more impactful. Here I'm just quickly looking at the elite seed treatment component versus the basic. All DeKalb corn now comes with elite seed treatment on it, so this really isn't a big deal now for DeKalb. But whenever I first started this, it was a choice that we gave people. But ultimately, the elite seed treatment has a positive yield impact and a big impact on the infection rates, and that's been common across all 3 years and all locations I've done this work. So now taking a peek at the V5 applications specifically. So in those boxes there are the treatments that had the V5 on the Susceptible hybrid. The checks would be just to the left of it. You can see a slight yield bump and a reduction in the infection rates with the V5 applications as well. So here I'm looking at the yield of the in-furrow applications on the Susceptible hybrid. So the check is in the middle at an average of about 228-ish. The Pro line had an average yield of about 229-ish, so a small bump on the Pro line, whereas the Luna Privilege came in at about 235, so a nice average yield bump with the Luna Privilege. This is just another graph that I did, and so what I did here was I sorted the entries based on their infection rates, and I put them in order of highest to lowest, and so you see those across there, and so the red line would depict those infection rates. And then I did a linear regression of the yield, and so basically you see an inverse relationship here, right, of as the infection rate goes down, the yield goes up. So having said all of that, let's look at how each individual component, what it did in regards to the infection rate. So the elite treatment had an overall reduction of about 28%, whereas the V5 fungicide only had a reduction of about 10%. The Pro line was sub 5, the Luna Privilege was a little bit over 20, the VT fungicide had the largest at about 43%, and then hybrid only at about 5. When I went back and looked at my summary from a year ago, the hybrid component had a much larger component when I looked at the 2020 data. As I look at my 2021 data in that, there is one location that was skewing the data really, really bad. And if I take that location out, the hybrid component on this chart would jump from 5 to 28%. And a year ago it was at 33. Just something else I wanted to point out quickly is that as I dug into that, one location from this year, while the tolerant hybrid showed much higher infection rates, it actually out-yielded the Susceptible by quite a bit. So to me, I just had to have maybe some spatial variability playing into my data and my notes that I was taking this year. So personally, it is my belief that my own data is underestimating the value that hybrid can have when thinking about crown rot. So now let me put that into context for you. So if a particular entry had a 20% reduction, I'm not saying we went from, say, 50% infection rate down to 30%. That 20% comes from a calculation basically of say you went from 50% down to 40%, so you had a 20% reduction in then the amount of infected plants. So what I did here was the green is what we just looked at, but the orangish colored bars here is I looked at just the impact of each individual treatment on the Susceptible hybrid. Because if you remember a while ago, I talked about each treatment had a bigger impact on the Susceptible hybrid. And here's what we see there. So the V5 fungicide and the VT fungicide had a nice bump when looking at more of just a Susceptible hybrid. One other sidebar comment I thought I would throw in here. The last couple years when I've been making that V5, V6 fungicide application, I've been using exclusively Delaro. Going forward, I would like to look at Delaro Complete, because as we look at the Luna Privilege data here, that Luna Privilege product is what was actually added to Delaro to make Delaro Complete. So I'm optimistic that maybe I can have a more positive impact with that V5, V6 fungicide application with Delaro Complete. Here's another way I thought about looking at the data this year, and this was just talking about the win rates of each treatment. So this is, if I look at what each individual treatment, how it compared in either the infection rate, as far as lowering the infection rate, or as far as providing a yield bump over the check, these are the win rates. So obviously, just like in most things, the higher the yield advantage you have, the higher the win rate's going to be, and basically that's what we see here. A few key takeaways I'd like to leave you with. First and foremost, there are no silver bullets. There are things we can do that will help minimize and alleviate the impact of crown rot, but there is nothing we can do that will totally eliminate it. There is a definite trend, though, in my data that says the more tools we deploy, the bigger the impact we can have on alleviating the pain of crown rot and driving yield. But not all of those tools have a positive return on investment. The fungicide applications at both V5 and VT both drive nice yield gains and positive return on investments. The elite seed treatment package over the basic seed treatment package drives a nice yield advantage and a nice positive return on investment. When I look at the in-furrow applications, some of them have driven nice yield benefits with positive return on investments, but some of them have not. The final thing I'll leave you with. Early on in the season, the things we can do are to try to limit the infection, right? So the seed treatment we have on our corn, whether or not we can do an in-furrow application, the V5 or V6 fungicide applications, those are all things that help limit the amount of infection that happens in that corn plant. And later in the season, it's all about managing stress or foliar disease that plant is going to go through. The VT fungicide application does not have any efficacy against Fusarium crown rot. What it's doing is helping alleviate stress and managing foliar disease so that late season stresses do not help magnify or make the crown rot more severe. Thank you greatly for listening today. If you have any questions whatsoever at all, feel free to reach out to me. Be more than happy to discuss any of this information in greater detail.